We open on a corridor inside Coal Hill School. The bell rings and class is dismissed. As students flood the hall, we focus in on a teacher, who enters the classroom of one of her peers, Ian Chesterton. Barbara explains to Ian that she is having troubles with one of her students, specifically one Susan Foreman.
Susan Foreman? Oh, she your problem too?
The two teachers sit, discussing the mysterious student who is troubling the both of them. Susan Foreman is a genius, bored by many of the classroom experiments which seek to barely confirm basic facts about chemicals. Susan Foreman is not socially fit to live in a modern British society. She doesn't understand the currency of the country, noting that the British government's supposed use of a decimal system hasn't started yet. Susan Foreman openly contradicts her teachers with scientific information which simply doesn't exist, insisting that studying the difference between the second and third dimension doesn't make sense if one doesn't include the fourth and fifth, time and space. Susan is very knowledgeable on the subject of Earth history. However, when Miss Wright offers to tutor Susan at her home, Susan turns her down, stating that her grandfather cannot stand strangers.
He's a doctor, isn't he?
When Susan's homework starts turning up subpar, Barbara decides to go to her home in person to speak with her grandfather, only to discover that the home listed on Susan's personal information is nothing more than an empty junkyard. Curious to see what the answer to this mystery actually is, the two decide to see Susan off themselves, before driving to the junkyard to see exactly what she does there.
Silly, isn't it? I feel frightened. As if we were about to interfere in something that is best left alone.
Wandering into the yard after Susan, the two are shocked to find that no one is there. Susan has seemingly disappeared, with no way out of the junkyard other than the way they came in. After doing some searching, they do come across one very strange anomaly.
What, it's a police box? What on earth is he doing here?
As another person enters the junkyard, the two teachers hide. The figure approaches the telephone box and begins to unlock it. But as Susan calls out to him from inside the police box, said figure suddenly recognizes that there are two people in the junkyard with him. A large argument ensues, wherein Ian and Barbara decide to leave to fetch a policeman. Just as they are about to leave, Susan's voice again emerges from the ship, and the two teachers rush into the police box despite an attempt to be stopped.
What do you like?
Inside the police box is a large, futuristic room, shining a bright and disruptive tint of white. Barbara is quick to decipher that the old man whom they had been speaking to was in fact Susan's mysterious grandfather, while Ian is completely in shock.
But it was a police telephone box. I walked all round it. Barbara, you saw me.
You don't deserve any explanations. You pushed your way in here uninvited and unwelcome. Oh, you wouldn't understand, of course.
But I want to understand.
Yes.
At Susan's pressing and the old man's annoyance, the two attempt to explain the ship to Ian and Barbara. The ship is a machine that can go anywhere and any time, created via the use of the relative dimensions from those outside to those inside.
The TARDIS can go anywhere.
TARDIS? I don't understand you, Susan.
Let me get this straight. A thing that looks like a police box standing in a junkyard. It can move anywhere in time and space?
Yes.
Quite so.
But that's ridiculous.
As the two teachers are barely able to understand what is happening around them, the old man speculates that the two would never go silently without alerting the proper authorities. He explains to Susan that letting the teachers leave means taking back off into the unknown, as a 20th century society would never accept them. Susan protests this, saying that she has grown accustomed to living on Earth, and that she would much rather leave the ship than leave her peers. The old man cryptically states that this means that Susan and the teachers must go together, flicking a series of switches that propels the ship into motion as it lets out a thunderous roar. Sometime later, the old man is the only figure in the ship who has managed to remain conscious, as the battered police box settles on an empty wilderness far away from London. A shadow looms into view. Thus ends the very first episode of Doctor Who. Doctor Who, as it existed from 1963 to 1966, is a true gem in terms of television history. Not only creating various monsters and concepts which have lasted far past the show's original life expectancy, but also telling a compelling character-driven story that entertained millions both then and now. Its brilliance and importance for the future cannot be overstated, but perhaps few would have pinned it as a project to last as long as it has. Counting the upcoming Christmas special airing in December, there have been in total 840 episodes of Doctor Who. If you add in spin-off material sanctioned by the BBC, that number escalates to 943. Rounding up for considerations of increased runtimes and special events, and you have to come to accept that one 25-minute black and white story about two teachers finding a police box in a junkyard has branched off nearly 1,000 televised chapters in the story of the universe surrounding it. In 1966, the show made its first huge change when it was decided to phase William Hartnell out of the role. There was no big speech explaining what was happening, no deep character analysis showing how the transition would affect those in the show. There wasn't even a word for the process shown on screen. All the audience truly understood was that on the 29th of October 1966, the one and only Doctor collapsed while piloting the TARDIS and swiftly changed into a new man. Since then, this decision has gone down in history as one of the greatest in the show's programming, allowing every single element to be replaced.
It's not only his face that's changed, it doesn't even act like him.
Meaning that it could continue to feel fresh and new simply by allowing new faces to take over. What people tend to forget, however, is that at the time, this was not a popular move by any means.
What have you done to BBC One's Doctor Who? Of all the stupid nonsense, why turn a wonderful series into what looked like Coco the Clown? I think you will find thousands of children will not be watching Doctor Who, which up to now has been tops.
An audience research project run by the BBC continues the sentiment.
Quite a few said that they did not care for the new style Doctor. He didn't seem right somehow, and they liked the series less than before. Once a brilliant but eccentric scientist, he now comes over as a half-witted clown, one viewer maintained. Another writing, "The family have really gone off Doctor Who since the change. They do not understand the new one at all, and his character is peculiar in an unappealing way." Some viewers saying that, although an excellent actor whom they much admired, he seemed miscast. "I think no other actor can play the part of the old Doctor as brilliantly as William Hartnell does."
And that right there is the core of it, really. To people who had started watching this show from the very beginning, they adored their little program about a loving space and time grandfather who fought with Daleks and met with historical figures like Marco Polo. And in coming to view the show in this very specific light, they had set for themselves very strange standards, where they should have been thinking of new Doctor Who stories as adventures with new characters who could show them similar ideas from a new perspective. They instead grew agitated at the show suddenly not fitting into their vision of it. In hindsight, the Patrick Troughton era of stories have become known to be some of the best in the show's entire history. The adventures were always gripping. The cast had a consistent and unique charisma and chemistry, and all of these elements came packed with a totally different feel from many of the stories that had been featured under the previous actor. When you boot up classic storylines like The Enemy of the World or The Web of Fear, what you realize is that you have the capability of being wholly invested in these featured sets of stories without having seen any preceding stories. You don't need to know a lot about the Doctor's origins or how he met his companions or how he stole the ship, because it's all about the thrill of surviving that specific situation.
We're going to put you outside, Salamander. No friends, no safety, nothing. You'll run, but they'll catch up with you.
The moment that Doctor Who claimed its legacy as a show that would last longer than any other was the single moment that it no longer became necessary to have seen the very first episode of the show, where understanding and enjoying the plot was almost hindered by thinking about the origin story presented in the very first episode. When most people are introduced to Doctor Who, very few of them are expected to start watching with an unearthly child. Some people go off to Rose, some people begin their trek with the 11th Hour. Hopefully we'll see a lot of people in the future saying that they started with the pilot, the first episode of Series 10. And what you'll find is that other than the odd continuity point or reference that is sent spiraling over their heads, these people are never hindered in their attempts to enjoy the show because of what they had missed because of where they started. But on the same level, these people who start watching the show at a specific point and then view everything after that as the true Doctor Who, often struggle with the idea of the show reaching that point where other people are allowed to get on. We like to pretend that Doctor Who is one huge spiraling staircase that is very much the same no matter where you go, brilliant in that it has been able to keep going on and on without ever changing. But in reality, the best way to look at the program is a series of completely unrelated television shows that have very little to do with each other outside of the basic outlines of what a TARDIS is. It's much like Sherlock Holmes. While the original printed stories illustrated the adventures of the titular character as brains over bronze as he solved mysteries in the 19th century, there have now been too many adaptations of the story to count, putting Holmes in the 20th century, the 21st century, even the 22nd. And those changes are only discussing what year the stories are set in. Well, imagine that you'd come to love BBC's 2010 version of Sherlock, as penned by Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss, and upon turning on the highly anticipated 5th season, you discover that it was literally just CBS's Elementary, but given the former show's title. To someone who loved Doctor Who as it existed under Christopher Eccleston and saw that as the ultimate version of the show, they would hate the version featuring Matt Smith simply due to its light-hearted nature. Someone who started watching the program as it existed under Tom Baker would not be able to stand the speeches that the Doctor seems to so often give in the revived series, all about who he is, what he does, and why he does it. Someone who started watching during the abstinent era of John Nathan Turner would roll their eyes as the Doctor went on to kiss every man or woman that he could at any particular chance. And someone who started watching with David Tennant wouldn't be able to understand how the show could have ever existed without any of those ideas. Every time that a change to the show has ever been introduced, that single quandary would rise straight out of the grave. Why not just make a new show? And the answer is, of course, that 99% of the people making such an argument are not speaking on behalf of a program that they perceive to be about an overprotective grandfather living in a junkyard. To suggest that every little change about the dynamic of the show demands that it be splintered off into its own entity is suggesting that any incarnation of the show other than the original is some sort of false goddess. Imagine your favorite era of the show not being able to use the word TARDIS, the word Gallifrey, the word Doctor, just because it wasn't exactly like the very first episode that aired in 1963. Keep in mind, we're talking about a show that at one point went 39 episodes without showing the interior of the spaceship that occupies the show. The famous police box was not viewed from the inside for nearly 40 episodes, with said box serving as little more than set decoration, and yet to many people, those 39 episodes are perceived to be some of the best Doctor Who stories to ever be created. This is a television program that has lasted, at this point, just about 55 years. And it did not do this by staying the same in terms of tone, cast, or direction. The show has constantly found new ways to change up the formula of their presentation, never being afraid to find a way to reinvent without resetting. If it doesn't make sense to consider the end of Doctor Who to be the first Doctor's regeneration, then it makes just as little sense to consider the end of the show to be the first Doctor's regeneration. Trust me, if you watch the thing, that point made sense. In the future, for better or for worse, I'm willing to allow new voices and faces to take Doctor Who in completely new directions. even if that means that the show is going to be totally different from here on out. Because this is a show that's built on change, and I think that it just doesn't make sense to impose limitations on those changes. And with that, I've been Quentin Reviews, and that's all you need.